TFTuesday Podcast. My name is Zilepo, and I'm really glad to have a very special guest with us today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, and thanks for having me on. I am Koorivlf. I am a TF artist. I draw a lot of different things, but that's primarily what I'm known for, at least in these parts. And I don't know. I'm a gamer. I really like ketchup. Ketchup is the god tier condiment.
Nice. I know you do a lot of TF artwork, obviously. You do streaming, you do kind of VR, AR stuff. What kind of drew you into that at the beginning?
So, well, I've always had an interest in like systems and how they interact in the world. Like, video games are just the big example of that, where you have different aspects that you're like trying to deal with in a system. So, like in Mario, you're trying to like figure out how you jump through a locate or like through a world, but that world is 2D, and like how do you interact with those objects and what's your goal? Like all those different systems are really interesting to me. I got into a lot of like the AR VR stuff because I really like systems and how everything interacts with each other. Because it's just one of those fun things where trying to figure out scenarios and how like a story progresses or just how like things progress in life is really interesting. So like a lot of my work or interests actually align with that. Like transformation itself is like the idea of the process, and that's an idea of like how do things work, how would you actually transform into something else, how would you like how would things merge in that sort of way, how are things affected. So things like AR VR just kind of like mash into that as well, where it's just like, you know, you have a controller set that's different than like the old style where it's just like binary inputs. You now have like analog 3D space that you can go through, or you have AR, which is still, it's just still like an overlay, but that overlay is really helpful for adding information to the world. And like that's just always been like such an interesting thing to me, because you can just enhance a lot of like life stuff, or you have like in games you have like control over what people see, so you can create a lot of really interesting experiences. And I always love exploring those sorts of things, or like how people view the world and then try to interpret that into their works. Like it becomes like a really cool way of seeing how other people like just think or want other people to think as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because I feel like VR in particular is kind of the ultimate version of like controlling how other people perceive you, and also like, talking about that whole process of like how do you navigate the virtual interface versus yourself as a person. Like that kind of marriage between the two is a way in kind of navigating your idea of yourself, and as you kind of mentioned, seeing almost like a TF of yourself into an avatar in a sense, and trying to kind of see how that changes the way in which other people interact with you, and also the way you interact with the rest of the world. It is kind of like one of those quote unquote like ultimate ways to kind of achieve that in a way.
Yeah, yeah, it's really cool. Actually, VR chat is a really good example of that dynamic. Cause have you played VR chat?
I haven't actually. I've seen people like go through it, but I personally haven't done it yet, just because I don't always have the space to properly navigate, and also I don't have like a VR headset.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, because there is like you can play it on desktop, but like it's a different feel from VR. But like a really interesting thing in VR chat that like happens is because people can change into like whatever they want, they like take on those features, or you get like there's this funny thing where you get like anime girl avatars just everywhere, and like it'll be cis like male buff sounding dudes in those avatars, and like they're completely still like still cis, still straight, like all those things, and like but they still express themselves like in a different way by taking on that avatar, which I find to be really fascinating. And then when you throw like furries into the mix, you start getting like people who go like, oh well, now I have a tail, so now I can start interacting with the tail, or like make jokes about the tail, and like you see people like kind of change how they move and stuff at points. Like you can tell if people get really into the avatar or just are just kind of like there. And I find that really fascinating, especially when we're at a point where we're only with two sensory inputs mostly, like visual and then like momentum or like movement. So I feel like once people have more access to even like more trackers and stuff, a lot more expression happens because like leg DLC is what it's called in VR chat when you actually get the trackers. But like you'll see people be more lively. I like even myself, I got the Thunder trackers and like I'm a lot more expressive in VR chat because of that. Like sometimes I'm not. Like it looks like I'm desktop mode at points because like in you can see how I just normally stand and it's very square. But like you get into it, like it's a really amazing way to express yourself, and with the added features of like you can be whatever you want. You start really getting to like, oh well, I have paws now so I can like stomp and stuff, or you have different like shapes, like you have a bigger belly or be more muscular, and like that, like you get people who like really go and play into that. And I find that to be really interesting because like even people who aren't into TF and stuff like really like change in a way because of how they're presenting. And like I find that just super fascinating psychologically, but also for technology, because we're at the start of, or we're at like the niche part where like it's people are still making things, but like they're not distributed that far and they're not always like supported. So once people realize like, oh well, if you can add any controller, well maybe you can start adding like 3D printing stuff so that like you have more like paw controllers, or you do have a tail, so like you can actually match your avatar and have more of like a connection to what's inside the realm. Or you get to like the Matrix where you just kind of plug in and then like you don't need all that extra stuff, but then that just becomes like a huge it'll be like it'll be really interesting to see like how people, when they're more immersed into that, will even go forward like with how they present themselves, and for like all the possibilities of if you can have better systems like for avatar changes instead of just like kind of popping from one avatar to another. Like if you can morph and stuff, then I feel like a lot of people will turn to TF simply because of VR actually. As a thing, again, I think that TF is fun because it's the process. And like I always feel like getting into TF, like for me I got into TF because of the whole like process part, thinking about how things worked, and that was because of like media when I was like young. Some of it was odd, like there was a movie called Indian in the Cupboard, which I haven't seen for many years, so I don't know if it's good or bad
Oh yeah.
anymore.
I know that one. Yeah, yeah.
Y-
It's the one where whatever you put in the cupboard or whatever comes to life
yes.
afterwards, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah,
And
yeah.
like,
I know the one.
yeah, and I always thought that was amazing because like the idea of just kind of like life comes from that one change, and like you have a very specific rule set for it was just like really interesting to me as a child. So like it wasn't like anthropomorphic or anything. It was just like the idea of like that's how a change worked. And then, you know, that was doomed when like Ben 10 or like anything else comes around. Because like at that point it's like, well, you have, it's also a cool design and you have this really neat rule set for all those things. So in VR and AR, you will also have those rule sets because computers are very dumb and have to follow very specific rule sets. So like it'll be interesting to see like how people go from like when it becomes a little bit more of like, hey, you're allowed to actually do more merging, or you're allowed to not be so pop in pop out. I feel like people will actually start going like, oh, it's cool that I change from like this form to this form. Or even like fashion, it will be like, well, I can change my clothes when I'm in lighting, and then when I go to a dark place my clothes change. And I feel like that's going to be something people think about a lot more, because it's a lot easier to do that when like there's not really physical restraints on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I find it interesting that you kind of brought up the whole like, normies who engage in like different personas kind of when they're in different forms, and the way in which inhabiting those different forms is unbound and kind of like the virtual space. It's maybe a little bit ham-fisted to say like, oh, these normies are engaging in personality transformation, but like that is kind of what's going on here. And I think that one of the really neat things about VR is that you are actually like allowing yourself to kind of mentally process, like you said, being in a different form and how do you interact with spaces. And, to some degree, video games have always tried to do that in some sense. I mean, you often will play a character character in a game, or you'll engage in a certain set of systems, and you have to think through the rules of the game as to how you can go from point A to point B, and you almost have to shift your mindset. So when it comes to VR, like you said, there is also kind of a shift in the mindset, but there's also the ability to change your form on the fly that really is starting to kind of come into more of the mainstream, be it, something as quote unquote normal as changing your outfit from 1 second to the next, to potentially having avatars that can actually completely shift from one thing to another. And I know that there are people out there who are already doing those things or making those changes in VR chat or the other virtual reality platforms out there. And I think it's really interesting that people are engaging with that. My only concern with that, I think, to some degree, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, as we've kind of seen virtual reality take off, there's other things that are trying to like kind of buy into it to some degree. So like, the quote unquote metaverse, or like big tech trying to like do whatever it is they want to do. And I guess my concern sometimes is, in some ways VR kind of feels like the beginning of the internet, when things were a lot more decentralized. And as we kind of saw with the internet, it ended up getting kind of consolidated, and a lot of the cool kind of quirks of like web rings and such got lost. So I guess my concern right now is I worry about that happening to VR, because it feels like such a like innovative growing space right now, and I don't want to see that squashed by other people who, are just looking to like make a quick buck. Now, I haven't gone to engage with VR as much personally, so I'd love to hear your perspective on where you see the VR space moving, and is there a concern that like the TF mods and such that people are making could get like pushed to the side as like corporate stuff comes in?
Yeah, that's a hard thing to answer, because back in the day where like you had the start of the internet, you had really techie people, like the nerds of the world, engaging with how people communicated. Like even if you look at like furry history, you talk to older people and they start talking about like mucks. And like that's a very weird thing to like hear nowadays, because it's like, well, now you can do like VR chat, like people who like just do full blown RPs or like things in like small worlds and then can actually act that out. So it's a different system and stuff just from that entirely. But like the idea is still the same as like you grab a group of people, you do a little thing, or you have like a little story that you're telling to yourself, and then that goes further. And when that started to like become more mainstream, you had more people kind of engaging with the internet and changing that so that you had like a lot weirder things come in. If you look at like old YouTube, it was like what, cat videos and just porn, all
And
the
random memes and porn,
yeah,
yeah.
like every thumbnail, even when it was like the news, was just like somebody's like tits, and it's just like it was clearly just to get like some old man to go like, oh, I found this on the internet, and
Yeah.
it's just like,
I found the booba. I must click, like
yeah, so it's like it's very weird. So like there's always going to be like that sort of weird interaction throughout like anything that happens, but the early internet was allowed to like just do wild things, sometimes really cool, sometimes like just the worst of humanity, because like people didn't understand it that much. It was still being learned about. Like you had nerds who knew about it, but like you still needed like how UI worked, because like people who know how to program don't know how the fuck anyone navigates anything when it's not like key presses. Nowadays, with like the metaverse being pushed and stuff, you actually have the whole concern of corporations know how the internet operates. There's already norms for how the internet operates. And if you can push like new norms that are more towards corporate interests, it's kind of hard to stop that. But at the same time, a lot of those corporations don't understand VR or AR itself. Like Zuckerberg kind of talking about like basically Office 2.0, where like you can have an office at home, and like no one wants that. No one wanted the
no one
office in the
wants
first
that.
place. So like being like, oh well, I can get you to experience the office even better. It's like missing the point, and that will actually probably throw off a lot of normal people to not like want to engage with VR, which means that you're probably actually going to get a lot more niche people to engage with, like making stuff, trying to figure out how it works, how it can be really good. So you will get kind of that leeway of like still interesting weird times that corporations just aren't going to be able to like hold. And VR chat, I think, is like one of those things where you can see that, where like it's still restricted to a certain extent, but there are just people who make random things, so you kind of like are clicking through a bunch of random worlds and you don't know what you're ever going to really find. And it kind of feels like early furry times where like FA wasn't a thing, or like it was but like not really. I think what So Furry was like Yifstar, because like when I was younger and I found that, I thought it was like a virus site. So like it was a
It kind
thing.
of does sound like a
it,
virus,
it
you know? The name really
it
does.
looked, well, like the site looked like it was like a virus site. Like it, like I clicked in it and it was just like, I'm not staying here. So like there were those places, but like you'd find more like VCL where it's just like basically a directory that you had to scrounge through, because there was no real like true organization of anything. So VRChat still has like some basic search features and stuff, so it does a little bit better than I think. But that also does mean that like it's hard to tell where the future will go, because you're going to get corporations that like want to make things sanitized and make it very productive oriented, while VR probably shouldn't be that, because like it is a way for humans to experience other things that they like just can't in real life, which is a good thing, because like again, for things for like transformation, that's very cool. It can also technically be bad, because like say that there's not enough housing in a location and people live in a very small space. Well, now you can have like people who are like corporations, or people who genuinely like want to help, or corporations usually don't, but like people want to help. You can have VR and be like, you live in this little space, but now you can be in VR and you can see, like, you can explore a large house. You can feel like you live in a larger space than you actually do. And that's kind of like dystopian, while also at the same time being a genuine way of like, you can explore something. Because at that point, it's like, well, why not just explore a house? Why not explore a cave that's not in your area? Why not explore space and understand how it actually works? And so it's very hard to know where that's going to go, because it's just, there's so many possibilities, and you're just kind of hoping that you're not going to hell clown world version of dystopian and go towards like, at least give us cool things if we're going to go into dystopia, because like
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely don't want to end up in the Ready Player One dystopia because God knows that one's depressing.
yeah, I haven't seen that. I've only seen like, it was like trailers stacked on each other, and that's like,
Yeah,
how do you
you know,
shop?
I didn't see the movie. I did read the book, which it sure is a book. But what I will say is, something that's interesting about it is it does touch on that thing you mentioned about like, having the compressed spaces. Because I remember a big emphasis was like, oh yeah, people just kept living in smaller spaces because they could do limitless stuff to some degree in VR. So it's interesting, I think, that you bring that up because I definitely think it's a concern. And like you said, like if corporations can find a way to sell you living in a smaller space and be like, oh, you can just do VR, it's like, well, okay, that's great in theory, but VR is supposed to be something that enhances your life. It shouldn't, maybe this is just me pontificating a bit, but it shouldn't like replace everything outside of it. And I think the concern is more like, we want to keep it as a place where you can, like you said, experience cool things like transformation and make it, our little weird little corner without it becoming like, fucking Walmart trying to like make a metaverse where you shop in the VR. Like I remember seeing
What,
that video and I was just like, what the
you
hell
don't
is
want the
going on?
shopping pod, the shopping
No, I
VR
do
pod?
not. I do not want the shopping VR
Parking
pod.
spaces take up a lot of like area landmass. So if you just make everything into the
Oh
pod,
God,
it would fix so many things very quickly.
that's true. There we go. We solved climate change, y'all. We
just
got we got rid of
just everyone get
parking
into the pod
spaces.
and everything will be fine.
Oh man. And speaking a bit about VR, I have also thought, I have seen actually a large uptick in transformation in just video games in general. And I wonder sometimes if that's maybe because like a lot of the folks who just grew up with it, it was especially prevalent in like cartoons in like the 90s and aughts and such, are now like entering those kinds of spaces where they can actually have a say over the creative direction of some of these games and such. Like to give you an example, I just finished playing Bug Snacks, which is a wild fucking time, by the way. But TLDR, there is a weird TF mechanic that's literally integrated into the game. And, sometimes you don't even notice it right away when it's being integrated in these more subtle ways into games. It's been really nice to see, but my thoughts is also like, is it really going mainstream or are we just over noticing things because they speak to us? I don't know. I was curious to hear your thoughts on that.
TF is hard to gauge like how mainstream it'll go or like how mainstream it is because actually let me ask you a question. How would you define TF?
Well, I consider it fairly broad. Generally, what I would say transformation can include anything from as small as like, like a shift in personality due to some sort of like external force all the way to like actually changing forms. So, sometimes to use, I guess, media as an example, it can be as overt as like turning red, or it can be as niche as like, you're playing through a horror game where your mental focus is shifting over the course of the game and you can't fully trust your perception. Like in some ways, that also kind of is a TF. So I consider it fairly broad. But I guess what I mean to say from my initial question is I'm noticing the more overt kinds becoming more and more common in a way that I felt they weren't in like the early aughts or
Mm.
the 2010s.
Yeah, yeah, similar to like what I think TF is, and that's because it's so broad. It's very hard to tell like because TF is just a really good story mechanic and also a good game mechanic. So the more fidelity you have, the bigger stories things need to get. Like it just makes a lot of sense to add things because like fun things come about because there's change. Like half of all story structures is literally like, oh, you have this character, you change him a bit, and now that's the end. And in between is where like the story happens. That's what the interesting part. So I think that for people who grew up with old media that had those different story types, that you do see those type of transformations coming about now, or like magical girls is like a very obvious example of like it's
Oh yeah,
like that
that's
wasn't
a
a thing that
classic.
was like always popular, always something in people's minds, but once Sailor Moon became like really big, that was where people started going like, oh well, I can do this thing. So like yeah, clearly that's a direct correlation of like you see magical girls turn into a whole genre that like recognized as a thing. But throughout history, if you
Hmm.
look back, like there's always transformation in different ways. Like you kind of can get like those weird stories of like magical girls actually started out in Egypt at this time because like it's kind of just history rhymes a lot. So I feel
Yeah.
like depending on how you're looking at like what transformation is when you'll see like if it's actually being incorporated or not. And like some I feel like some TFs will kind of drop off in popularity and stuff, and thus they'll kind of cause people to
Hmm.
notice and focus on different things. But also because there's the internet now and information travels so fast, we may actually be more at a point where like sure things become less noticed and stuff, but you just get spread out into like a lot of niche communities that kind of keep intersecting. So those aspects
Yeah,
will
that's
kind
true.
of just be like an overlapping vine of different inspirations for how those TFs are managed and stuff, and are never truly like really lost to time, just because like there'll just be so much
Yeah.
data storage of like figuring out where it kind of started, or at least have remnants of it that are just going to keep continuing.
Yeah, honestly, God bless the internet in that sense because there are so many cool TF media things that, we now know will always have some sort of a place somewhere and won't get lost, like so much of physical media can, unfortunately. I mean, it's always good to have backups in both senses, but in terms of what you said in terms of the spread of information, I mean, I think that's definitely also part of the uptick because like you said, when something comes out all of a sudden it'll be all over like your timeline on Twitter or your feed or like whatever because everyone who's kind of tuned into the same spaces is like, oh yeah, like there's this clip of this or there's this clip of that. So I guess, to some degree when I think about it in media generally but also like specifically video games, I think there is an element of because things can be shared so much more easily, it's easier to notice them because they will just percolate, like you said, into specific communities. And even with games or media or what have you that you might not necessarily gravitate to, if it has that one specific thing that that one niche really likes, it'll spread like wildfire. And you'll be like, well, I've never heard of, X piece of media, but like, damn, those feeds do be changing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's just gonna be more of what inspirations become about, and like how things will kind of merge. Like it'll be the original idea of like memes, not in the sense of like they're jokes, but like when the meme first started out, it was just the idea of biology and evolution works by like having non-random mutations kind of go throughout the animal kingdom. So like you still see similarities, but there is definitely like changes in those designs, like eyes. Like a human eye is very different from an eagle eye, different from like a frog eye, but they're still like eyes. So I feel like that's just going to be more of what media is that you have somebody who starts something and it goes out and then it just keeps changing, and eventually you'll come back to where it's like, oh, this was clearly the source, but like it'll just keep being mutated and replicated so that everything kind of merges together, and it's hard to figure out like what the true inspiration is unless you actually are an archaeologist trying to like look through the threads of where things have come from, rather than like
and really examining
rather than like the past where it's just like, there's this famous book and this is the only book that we kept because all the other ones burnt or got like drowned out by like some water, so like this is our main inspiration now. I think that'll be less of a thing over time.
I agreed. So essentially the more TF there is, the more they'll change our perception.
And then eventually we're going to get a scientist who likes TF, and then they just create outright TF.
You know, I keep wanting that to happen. I'm like, come on, y'all. Like, we have so many people going into, like, biology and, like, nanoengineering. And I'm like, come on, where's the TF, man? Like, there must be TF fans out there who are in these fields. Like, where is my tail? I'm still waiting.
Yeah, scientist,
like, come on.
Where is that? Where's my tail?
Yeah.
Give me tail.
So
I will give you a whole $10 for tail.
Yes. And if you drive a hard bargain,
Yeah.
we might give you 11. You know?
Yeah.
You know, for science. I was curious to ask you your thoughts on how you've kind of experienced TF and like the transformation fandom when it comes to being a person of color. You know, I'm mixed. Oftentimes I'm perceived as white passing, so I want to recognize that I experience some of these things in a different way. But I've always felt that the way in which transformation kind of came to me and how I've thought about it really made me question, like, what is it about being human, being into transformation or TF, say about me and reacting to kind of the systems that surround all of our lives. So I was kind of interested to hear, like, has transformation always been kind of like a natural home for you? And like, how did it impact your view on yourself and how you navigate through the world?
So there kind of needs to be some core lore, I guess, IRL core lore. So I'm a person of color, but I too am mixed, but a lot of people don't actually know what race I am, which is very annoying because, like, in the all actuality of life, race isn't actually a real concept. It was just like made. Othering people has always been a thing throughout time, but racism, the concept of race, was an invention that basically made it to where you could, instead of trying to go like, oh, well, this random group of people who like maybe believe in a different religion or live in a different area are bad, you can instead like try to make it into a centralization of traits, so that if, say, a company wants spices from an island and people are like, it's bad to kill people, and you just go like, well, this is a race of people who are savages. And then, like, for some reason, everyone just goes, yeah, because they're not human anymore, we can just steal their spices. And then, like, terrible things happen.
Yeah, imperialism and colonialism 101.
So it's such a weird thing because, like, as a kid, I lived in Florida, which is, like, the south of the U.S., which is always the joke of, well, it's not the joke, but, like, that's supposed to be, like, the more racist place. Mm-hmm. And I've always found that the U.S. has different flavors of racism depending on where you go in life.
Yeah.
And in Florida, I always felt like I lived in a city-ish area that was near enough wealthy people that had a lot of resources, but it was still underdeveloped enough to where, like, it wasn't that far away to go to, like, a swampy area or just more rural areas. Like, it's not that hard. Nowadays, I feel like the city looks so different. But, like, when I was a kid, it was a lot simpler times in at least that area.
Right.
And so when I was born in 1994, the statistics for, like, approvals for interracial marriage was, like, below 50%. So because of that, nowadays it's, like, 94, 96%, which is bad because it's not 100%, but, like,
it should be 100%. That's true.
Yeah, it should be 100%. But, like, you can see that there's a change in time for, like, how things work. Like, people are like, yeah, I finally accept mixed race people. Mm-hmm. But the problem with that is, like, if you're a mixed race person and people treat you as, like, the starting question of if you're fine or not, you get a lot of people who are just completely awful to you. And that's like been my experience. Is like the earliest memory I have of somebody just outright racist was going from Publix, which is the best store, and uh, m-
I full disclosure, I know nothing about like U.S.
okay,
store chains, but
okay, yeah. So it's
continue.
Publix is a stores, like a set of stores that's mostly in the South. I think I know it is like a Southern store, and like it's just a really nice place. It has a nice atmosphere. Like I'm not gonna do a lot of advertisements for things, but like Publix, I probably actually would, because like I just have a lot of fun memories there. But when I was leaving there with my mom at one point, like if my mom's alone, then like she won't get bothered, but like if I'm there, then the thing of like, oh, you betrayed your race by marrying somebody that was outside of it just gets brought up, which is really a bad feeling, because it's like my existence around my family inherently causes issues. And in that like parking lot, there was like a dude that like I was like 3 4 years old, so like young woman, little baby core, going through the parking lot just trying to go to their car after shopping, and you get this person like yelling slurs and saying like that my mom had like done a terrible thing, and not those words, in a lot worse ways. And like clearly like they could have been a threat, like they can't like protect themselves that much, like it's a big ass dude who's being like really threatening, and like kind of feel like they could be violent. So when I was younger, I just kind of saw that as like an asshole sort of thing. Like I knew that was racist, but I didn't understand the context as to why it happened.
Yeah,
So
you were a kid. Like you didn't have the full context of like how these systems work and how they're deployed against, children as young as like, from birth.
yeah, and like so when I was growing up, I still like learned mostly from like the public school system and like TV shows of like everyone's equal and stuff. Those people who are racist are just assholes and are from the olden times. And like that was just a thing that I learned, not really realizing that like people didn't approve of interracial marriage quite as much when I was born, and even when I was like a kid, like it was very low. So you had a lot of people who were racist, and like I didn't understand that context. And eventually I moved up to Michigan. Michigan's racism always feels like it's very backhanded. You will get people who are like, oh yes, we are all equal, but some of us are a little less equal than others. It was always said in like a nice, quote unquote nice way of, oh, you're one of the good ones. And it's just like, what does that mean? Are there bad ones? Bad ones of what? So that made me feel like very depressed. And when I learned about like the fandom, I was learning now that I was gay, but I had to be straight because I didn't want to be gay because, gay was seen as bad. Like that was just the word for bad at school. So I didn't want to be
Yeah, it
gay.
got thrown around a lot as a slur back in the day, and
Yeah.
FYI to the younger folks, because it was. I went through that too, so I feel that.
Yeah, so and then I was like, I can be bi because I've learned that from the internet, and it's people around me were like, no, that doesn't exist, and like my family was actually fine with like gay people to a certain extent. Like it was one of those, they're fine, they're okay, but like you probably shouldn't be gay because like you're gonna have a bad time, and it's not always out of like malice. Like I had one parent who thought I was gay because I'm very non-sexual IRL. Like people like get stunned by like how much I do not interact with that topic if I'm just like out in the wild, and people just like find it really weird that it's like, why don't you talk about tits? And it's just like that I don't want, like, what, why, like in like, well, why don't you talk about dicks if you're gay? And it's just like I like why do I just want to
Like, bro, not everyone talks about this
I
stuff,
just want to buy my
like
groceries, man.
yeah.
um
At Publix.
yeah, so like I had a parent who didn't want me to be gay, not because they didn't want me to be gay, but they were very worried about the AIDS crisis and how they knew people who like had died, and they were worried about like, well, if I was gay, then like I could possibly have a horrible life, and they didn't want that for me. So like that's not malice, but also it was not always helpful.
Yeah, it's not great.
So I had to deal with that. I had moved to Michigan. That backhanded racism me, and without context I felt really terrible about myself because it was no longer like assholes saying things. It was like people I liked and trusted that were saying terrible things. Or I had discovered the internet, and like the assholes who were like dumb and idiots, you learn that like it's a cop out to do or to say, because a lot of them are smart, and if you look at their logic, it is insane. It does not make sense, but like there is a logic to that racism, and that racism is like good for people if you're not the oppressed person, because like you gain a lot of power from that. Like if there's only a limited amount of jobs in an area and you want a higher chance of getting that job, you just need to make certain people an underclass, and like it won't mean that you get the job, but it's a higher chance that you do. So like learning that sort of logic, it's like you can see how smart that idea is and like how methodical that can be. And like
It's insidious.
yeah, so as a kid, both being gay, moving to a new place that was the backhanded racism, and seeing all that information from the internet that was allowing me to access just everything at that point, and without like all the context or even filters that are existing today, because like Google back then did not have a filter. It was just like if you search something, it's just you got the thing. Even if like you searched like porn was one of those things
Oh
where
yeah,
like
it just came up.
like I would
It
search
just fucking came
history,
up.
I just get porn. It's just like I didn't search for porn. I was just searched for history, and I'm like 13 years old. What the hell? I actually found the furry community by just like, I don't remember what I searched, but I found this picture of like a fox, a blue fox, and I think a pink fox. And like for some reason it just triggered in my head that was this really cool thing that people can make, because I never thought about like people could make that. So I had discovered like a fundamental thing I really liked, while also feeling bad about racism, while also being confused about why I liked dick. And all that combination meant that like I lurked for a long time in the fandom. And when I did start like actually like being more present in like 2014 to like the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, I was actually very cautious about talking about my race. So I feel like I have a really weird experience, because talking wise, there's a stereotype of like how certain people talk to like guess their race, and most people just assume that I'm white while I'm talking. So I have a privilege in that I can get away with a lot by like not mentioning anything. So like a lot of times I wouldn't mention that, and it just because people would just assume like, oh well, if you're not saying that you're a person of color, then you're just white. And it's like, okay, I'm going to take that assumption. So like a lot of the horrible stuff that I saw or that I experienced when I would say that I'm a person of color, like I purposely avoided that in the fandom. So my time overall has been like fine, because I haven't had to deal with that. And then when I did like actually start being more vocal of like, hey, I'm like mixed and like I'm not white, like it's a whole thing. And like race isn't even, it's just a weird topic anyway.
It is a weird topic.
So like, but like I do exist as like a non-white person. I still didn't get a lot of racism because of that. I feel like because I just scare people. But like I did start to like talk to other people of color at that point, because then that point was like, oh hey, you're a person of color too. And so like I know stories of a lot of racism in the fandom, and I have talked to people who are like extremely racist, or like have found groups that are like super fascist and thus are also just casually super racist.
Yeah, they just sprinkle it in there, for flavor.
Yeah, but so like so far I've been able to choose when I've interacted with that for the most part. Like I don't get many people who like come to me and try to pull shit. But like when I do deal with that shit, like it can get really dark. Like I always try to like, I don't forgive people quite easily for like saying dumb shit, but I also don't go like, oh well, you're evil, you can never learn, stuff like that. I try to like explain like this is how it works, this is why it's bad, stuff like that. And like I've had people where I've let them assume that I'm white, and then like I've started talking to them about the issues and they're fine listening to that, and then the moment that I go like, well, I'm not white, there's like
and their demeanor changes.
yeah, and like at point like I've had a person directly just start going like, I need to know your race, and it's just like, no you don't, because my facts and logic have beaten your stupid dumb statements. But it's just like I need to know your race, because otherwise I can't understand your thought process, and also like how any of your logic works, because we're fundamentally different. And like there are people like that in the fandom, so like that's always a concerning thing of that experience, just knowing that's a thing, which is why I like try to be vocal a lot of the time. Because like I would prefer to stick to the whole I've had a pretty good time in the fandom myself and not having to deal with those problems, and like keeping it that way, because I know that at any point if anyone feels like pulling that shit, it can become a bad time, because like other people are open about that, and because they're very vocal about that, they have a bad time. And like especially if you're smaller, you can get picked on a lot easier. While like again, I feel like if you're a little bit bigger or like a little bit more confrontational, people kind of back off, because like most racist people are, again, it's bad to say like people are ignorant, because like that's not usually the case. They may not know what they're doing, but they're not dumb about it. But also, most of them are like baby shit cowards.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh no, they're looking for an easy win. They're not looking to actually like, engage with these people and try to like get like a oh I got him thing. Like they want an easy win to like validate themselves and then they retreat back. So when it's like a big person, it's almost like, oh, this isn't going to be worth it because I can't win. It's like there's like almost like a game theory going on in their minds of like, can I win the racism against these people? Yes, no. If no, then I won't
yeah,
engage.
because power is the only thing there. It's that it's all about power. So if there can be power, then that works. But if there's no power, then like there's just so many of them are afraid all the time. And like if you point that out, then they start like trying to be a little bit tough, but like you can easily just push back because they're always cowards. Because at the end of the day, the point that they're trying to do is trying to put people down so that they have more opportunities, so that they have more power. And when that isn't allowed anymore, they won't do it anymore because it can't work. Also, they get disadvantages, which is why people then like nowadays have started being annoyed and going like, I'm canceled because like I said that I wanted to like have a gun because a black person was in Walmart. I don't understand. That sort of thing where it's just like you can't, like, you know what you're doing. Like you're not that dumb. And if you are that dumb, then like that's concerning.
Yeah. And I kind of want to circle back on something I had mentioned earlier, like in terms of how you kind of engaged with TF. I mean, you touched a little bit in your answer in terms of like, you were in this bad place, you were dealing with the backhanded racism and also like grappling with being queer. Have you ever like thought retrospectively, like, did you turn to TF as an escape and then kind of like hid in it, or did you feel like it wasn't so much an escape as it was a comforting space to like mold yourself in a different way from how the world was trying to mold you?
TF for me, I think, was both a comforting space, but also was just kind of like a place to play the idea of like not being human. Because the racism I experienced when I felt bad about how I existed, like the idea of me being subhuman to people made me think like I didn't want to be human anymore. Especially that like I was also in like my edgy times where it's like the world is dark, everything is cruel, there's always war. So like that didn't help at all. So like the idea of like transformation of like, well, if I could be what I wanted to always be, what would that be? Would I want to even be like a biological creature? Would I want to be like a machine? Would that actually be good? Or like how would I actually engage with myself? There's always like a weird question when you do TF for like, if you transform into dog, how does your brain go over to dog? Because a dog brain and a human brain are different, and not even in like a, oh, they're super different, but like in the sense of like food. If you have a creature that can't eat certain things and you transform into that creature, you may not get the stimuli to eat those certain things anymore. Dogs still will eat chocolate, but they're not going to eat as many vegetables because they're more carnivores. So like if your interest in food changes, are you the same person? And that sort of question of what essentially becomes you was a question that I needed to answer for myself to feel better about myself. So transformation was just like a way to like do that in a fun way and have it be a comforting way, because it was like it would just be cool to be a motherfucking dragon and like fly around and stuff. But also, if I could transform into anything, what would I be comfortable with, and like what am I comfortable with myself now? And like transformation helped me a lot understand like what it means to essentially be a person, and it made me feel like, I had worth, because then it was like, well, the whole concept of changing and stuff means that like there are certain aspects that like I'm fine with always keeping, even if other people think that those parts are bad. And that's that sort of like thing I think was really cool. It definitely did help me in like a time where like it really needed to help me, but also it allowed me to also think beyond that, because like at that point you're thinking about like, well, if you could TF, like what things are you missing at that point, or what things do you have advantages of? Like hands are pretty cool, but paws are also really cool. But like if you want to open up a doorknob, the hand is better. So there's always those sorts of things where like that experience of trying to think about how TF relates to my life and also my interests of like systems or aesthetics or anything like that, like was the thing that really got me into TF. And then there was a lot of cool people where I was lurking from afar for a long time, and I'm still kind of a lurker. I'm I feel like I'm always going to be a lurker, but like, and that
As much as you can lurk with, 20,000 Twitter followers.
yeah. Well, a lot of people know of my work, but they don't always know like me. So I've had a lot of experience
True.
where it's like I talk to somebody and they don't know they do not know who I am, and that's always a fun experience of like either like you meet somebody and like they're very nice to you, and then they go like, oh shit, it's you, and it's like hi. Or you get people who are like very dismissive, very mean to you, and then they realize and they're like, oh, it's you. Oh, don't you want to be buddies? And it's just like, no. and and TF was like for people in the TF community, like they also helped me watching people talk or like discuss their own thoughts on TF or like the sort of things that are created, like really helped me figure out people who were like nicer or better and like made me less pessimistic about the world as well. And so like not even like the subject of TF, like the subject of TF helped me, but also the people in the TF community were also helpful, even if it's still always a mixed bag at points for anything that you're into. But like I think overall like the subject and the people who are brought to that subject like really helped me. And also I feel like it's just kind of a helping force because when your fascination is with like thinking about how things change, I feel like you just get more people who are very cognizant about like how things operate, or at least how things relate to other people or to themselves. And that's just a very important aspect that like I really like and also needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely don't want this to be like negative on like a lot of folks in the fandom because I agree. I think a lot of people just by being interested in TF have a more open mindset. That's not to say it's 100%. It should be. It's not. But I think a large portion of people are actually open to these kinds of topics and listening and really understanding where people are coming from. I've kind of looked at TF through both a gender lens and a racial lens just because it's affected me in two very different ways. I found that like TF from like a gender perspective can be I'm inhabiting a form that I just feel more comfortable in. And from like a racial perspective, it is that to some degree, but also it makes me like better value myself as a person. And I think that's a kind of an interesting concept because when I was growing up, kind of similar to you, like in the Michigan context, like Canadian racism is a very specific flavor and it's similar to kind of what you described, but it can be really dehumanizing at times when people kind of approach you in a specific way and have that specific lens. And so being able to kind of reclaim some of that power sometimes through transformation and kind of like better understanding yourself, I think is a really valuable aspect of transformation in general that I just don't really see talked about a lot. And again, sometimes it's also because plenty of folks don't really want to like necessarily open up about that all the time. I definitely have been quiet before and I try to be more vocal now as well. I think with myself, I had a bit of a different, I guess, exposure lens because I'm always in front of the camera anyway. So it was always going to be present there no matter what. But, putting that aside, I think that it's been good to see people be more vocal about it. I think people have really been more supportive of folks of color, especially more recently. But I think, it's always going to be something that needs to be worked through. And I just want people to be cognizant of that because I think it's a really important topic.
Yeah. Yeah, those issues need to be talked about more, and I feel like always need to be explained more because like if more people understand, like there's never always going to be 100% understanding because even if you understand the history and all those things, like the constant pressure of things can also just is an experience in and of itself. So like there's just always going to be stuff missing, but I do feel like it's one of those things where like if you talk about it more, people do understand the majority of it more, and at that point you also get a lot of cool diversity from that because like a lot of my artwork that I've made has at points like I answer some questions I have within my artwork or like ideas that I have are things of like I want to explore, or I guess, well, sorry, I'm trying to think of a good one. So I have a
No, it's
character
all
named
good.
Anon who is a like a black character who turns into like a white wolf because I was always thinking about like one as like an easy sketch thing. It's like that's in high contrast, so it's like really nice as a thing. But also it was something where it's like I didn't see, like I always saw a lot of white people turning into like brown werewolves because like a lot of fur is brown, so like you get that just it's a common change. So I always thought about like, well, why isn't this a thing? And like white fur is very pretty, and also like that dynamic I always thought was like a very cool thing. So I wanted to make a character that was like that, and like that sort of thing. I feel like it's always really cool to see like other people do. I didn't make them do that, but like just like I didn't always see that, and then the like more people talked about that, then I did actually see like more of that sort of theme or people doing those sorts of things at the same time. And it's like it's very cool to see that when you get like a diverse set of people who actually are making those TFs, you get like those similar themes or thoughts, I feel like, and like get to see more of that. That always makes me really happy, because then you just get to see more ideas in like anything that happens, and that makes TF a lot better, because you also just get like more of it, which, you know,
which is always good. We always want more TF.
We always more TF.
Yeah, but I definitely I will also just echo that, and I think that, you know, something I'll say that's been really nice to see in particular is oftentimes, especially way back when you just see like a quote unquote generic person getting TF'd, it was almost always a white person, and now I think there's a lot more diversity in that, and I really appreciate that, because it's really nice to see that, you know, anyone can be TF'd, and that's what we should be thinking about. Anyone can undergo the amazing changes of transformation, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, everyone TF right now.
Everyone should TF right now.
TF Tuesday, let's go.
Yeah, it's TF Tuesday. I did also want to touch on something you kind of mentioned a bit earlier, you know, in terms of like how we kind of interact with the world and like how that changes when you get TF'd. So you mentioned like the dog with, you know, eating, and like how does like changing kind of affect your interests in like certain types of food and stuff. I always thought it was interesting, you know, one of the common tropes is, oh, I'm TFing into like a feral animal and now I can't use the doorknob kind of thing. And then, you know, you'll see in the stories people try to find a way to navigate around that. So like, for example, if it's a phone and you don't have your hands anymore, it's like, well, I can use my nose as a pressure thing. And it's a really interesting way to kind of think about how accessible the world is to people. So I kind of was interested in getting your thoughts in terms of like how you view transformation as being like a tool to like kind of solve the way in which, you know, the world is so kind of oriented around human folks, and the interesting kind of questions I think that that can pose.
Yeah, TF around accessibility, I feel like for the most part, I feel like TF targets more of like what problems there are more than solutions a lot of the time, because a lot of TF, it is fun when it's just like, hey, this is a barrier that's now happened, because it's a very immediate, like, because you have changed, this thing has directly changed because of that. But because those issues are also brought up, I feel like sometimes you get cool solutions from that, or you get people trying to think about like, well, what would you do if you did need to like actually like dial the phone number and you didn't have hands anymore, or like how if you wanted to use a smartphone but like you only had feathers, like would that, like how would you actually deal with that? Like I feel like is because people are thinking about that more, is actually a really good indicator to figure out and see like where we need to fix problems, or even like just seeing like how socially we think about how objects should operate, like hand in a doorknob. We can make doors like different designs that it's easier to open up a door without having to like grip it or anything like that. Or if you are a small creature, like if you're a little rat, a bunch of stairs is like a bad time.
Oh yeah.
So like
that's gonna be a fucking workout just to get up 3 steps as a rat, you know?
Yeah, like you can do it, but like it would maybe be nicer for like ramps and stuff like that, or even for like mental stuff. Personally, like I'm dyslexic, so like thinking about like how language works if you turn into another animal has always been like, I haven't actually done it, which I'm surprised, but like I've seen other people do it, where it's like if you become an animal and like your language processes change, like how do you actually interact with that language and communication at that point?
Mm-hmm.
Because human beings, one of the special abilities of human beings is that they have syntax, and that they're able to exchange ideas and like magical words and sounds. And like, you know, dyslexia for me, well, dyslexia in general is the issue of comprehension of languages and symbols. So having that experience specifically is a thing like that did cause a lot of issues. It still does, but like it's very interesting to see people like then put that into artwork and go like, oh well, this is a change that like can happen. And that in and of itself, I think, is like super interesting, that people are thinking about those things and like spotting those problems. Again, not always giving solutions to them. Sometimes people do, because sometimes it's like, well, if you have a phone, you can also make the phone a little bit different so you don't have those problems, even for general stuff. video games also like have more accessibility now because like
Oh
it's
yeah, way more.
like you can it's very easy to like change like colors and stuff, and like if you're being thoughtful, you can add things so that people have more access to those things.
Oh
And
yeah,
by get
you have to be cognizant of it.
yeah, so like just that awareness alone I feel like is very helpful, and also brings up a lot of like questions of like, if you're a tiger and you can do all these things, but like the language processing of stuff is like reduced, that doesn't make them like worse or anything. It becomes a cool thing. It just becomes like a difference of dealing with the world. And then
Yeah,
that's the sort of thing of like, you do see like TF at that point where it's just like people are like still happy and stuff, and like I feel like that's really nice that people do think of that as like it's not a bad thing, but it's like a good
yeah,
thing
it's
that
just a different thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
like it's a nice thing because it's different, and that difference means that like you get to experience a lot of different things in the world, which again can also be bad because like you can also like
yeah.
going like,
I mean, it's
oh
not always good.
yeah, like going like, oh, like I can't open up the doorknob, oh how terrible, can also be kind of bad because it's kind of like trivializing like that sort of thing, or like people not making door designs better because they're not thinking about that. But like I think overall it's still a better thing that people are thinking because of that, the idea of like change and relating to the world and stuff, that you have people focusing on those issues and also making it into like sometimes a fun thing, also sometimes a bad thing, sometimes a good thing, like just have a range of things because of that. And like a lot of, for me personally, like a lot of ideas of like what things need to be like fixed, or like considerations for what to do because of people's differences, is has come from TF as well. Of course it comes from people like just directly talking about it and be like, hey, design things better, but also like people having that be like, oh, that is a neat idea, that like this is a thing that people have to deal with, or that this is a thing that someone could have to deal with, and like how easy it would be to fix that, or like how the mechanic of that works, because people are thinking about that in like really neat ways. And I always thought that was like just really cool of TF to
Yeah,
have that.
yeah, and it's funny. I always focus specifically on the hands trope for me because I myself have dysgraphia, which is kind of like a cousin of dyslexia. So my fine motor skills are fucked, which is also why I never went into drawing because I literally cannot do that. But I always find it interesting when that part kind of comes into the TF because there's some parts it's like, I mean, obviously like moving a doorknob is like one thing. That's not really what I'm talking about. But even just like at the beginning of a TF when someone's like, "Oh, I can't really like hold this thing proper anymore." I'm like, that's my life. And I always find it interesting because like I'm not saying like it's representation because it's not, but it's interesting, like you said, to have people think about things in that way because sometimes people just go through life and they don't really think about those things, but TF can open up those possibilities. And like you said, like it doesn't always necessarily identify solutions. Sometimes it can, but at the very least, it gets us thinking about some of these things. And I think the thing that I always hope folks take away from transformation is just looking at the viewpoints of other people or animals or things and thinking about how we can reframe that into like our real world and be like, hey, maybe that's a problem. Maybe we should do something about it. So I always focus on the hands for that particular reason because I think it's interesting. But also, I think you made a great point around the language processing when you're kind of TFing into an animal and like, how do you express that? And like, even taking that a step further, I oftentimes, and I've seen you do stuff in this vein as well, like we'll engage with stuff with like more inanimate stuff like pool toys. Sometimes they're like fully active, sometimes they're not. But it's like, if you're made of like a different material, how does that affect the different systems that you want to interact with? Like, latex doesn't work on phone touch screens, like how are you going to navigate that? So I always think it's interesting when those concepts are explored in TF, and I just want to encourage people to continue to do that because it's an interesting way to kind of zero in on problems that exist in our everyday.
Yeah, yeah, it's really cool all the time. People should do it more,
Yeah,
especially with
people
pull
should. Yeah,
toys.
yes, especially with pool toys. God, I please more pool toy TFs. So I'm asking for many things, but like I'm asking for that specifically. Like, come on. And in terms of like materials in general, I always think that this is sometimes an underrated thing in TF, but there's a lot of interest in like the tactile senses because, a lot of how a lot of folks interact with the world is, through the sense of touch. Like, this feels hot, this feels cold. I like the feeling of like something soft and what have you. And I always find that like, whether it be like, oh, someone's like excited about themselves becoming latex and it's smooth, or like, really liking the softness of like fur with a tail, or like rough edges with a scales. I always find that that's an interesting kind of topic that people, I don't think it gets discussed as much. And in particular, in like some of the work that you've done, I've definitely seen there can be sometimes an emphasis in kind of like rubbing up and down, like as you're changing and being like, oh, like, experiencing kind of that new form. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on like how you think about integrating that into your own work, and like is it something that's top of mind, or is it something that maybe comes in towards the end, or maybe it's something that's subconscious for you?
I feel like that's a thing that's on my mind most of the time,
Mm,
just because for most material things, like visually, people do. I feel like people do like explore it, not always like thoughtfully, like not always like directly thinking about it, but like people do tend to interact with it. I think that like you find. I'm not a big story reader, but like some of the story, like TF stories I have read, do discuss like materials or like how things feel and stuff. So I feel like at least in writing that's more of a thing than in like visually, but I feel like visual stuff is a lot more out there, so that's the majority of the discussion is like what people are doing inside of a picture at points. But for like my work, I try to think about usually how just things interact, and because I'm thinking about how things interact, materials instantly comes into mind. Because like if you have fur and you have honey and you get honey stuck to the fur, well then like the fur can be soft, but like it's gonna now be sticky with all that honey, so that's gonna like change like how you interact with the world. Or even like on a base level for like any artist, I feel like that has to deal with muscles and bones and stuff like that. You have to think about like, oh, this bone connects to this muscle, so then the skin folds like this. And like a lot of people like, or I feel like a lot of artists who like get into the nitty gritty of like those sorts of things start really thinking about like how everything keeps interacting with each other. So materials is an extension of that, where like you're thinking about like this material is going to interact with this thing. And if you are like a pool toy, how does that work? Are you filled with air, or is it like magical air? Like how does that work? Because like if like an inflated pool toy is different from a deflated pool toy, and like what it can do, or like how like it can feel like latex, but like of course like if you press like a really inflated pool toy, like it's very different feeling than just waggling it around. And like same thing goes for like gooey substances, where like how viscous is it can change like how you're interacting with it, how it will go around things, or how it will like push things, how much force does it have, how much force does it need to have, because like all that is also then affected by like gravity. One of the bad things about thinking about all that stuff is that like you like, at least for me, I start going down a rabbit hole at points where I kind of just have to stop, because like you do start going like, okay, well you have this material and now you have gravity, but what about the air and what about the temperature and all this? And at points like people don't care if you have all that
yeah,
detail, and at points it's just like, I'm just gonna pretend that it's not there.
it just all works. Yeah.
But like personally, like if I'm thinking about stuff like if you get me talking enough, like I will think about like, oh well, if you have this interaction, then that means that you have this interaction, and that means that you have this interaction. And like of course I miss things because like I'm focused on certain aspects, because like if I start talking to other people about how each interaction works, like people will go like, oh well, I know like biology more, so I know that this is a thing. And then like it becomes a really fun discussion about like how those things interact and stuff. And then that goes into my work, because then it's like, well, I know this interaction is here now, so now I can add this to the list of
Figure it
things
out.
I have to worry about. And like
Yeah.
it becomes both like a fun and horrifying time.
Well, I mean, I will say that, like in terms of like some of the, like to use a recent example, I know there was a pool toy TF you did of an anthro that was like based on like sunscreen. and like the way in which you did kind of the spreading was really interesting to me. So now I wonder, like, were you thinking about like, oh, how is gravity going to affect the spread, and like how is, the sensation of like the inflation or what have you going to affect the character as he's kind of going through it? Because I think you did kind of like integrate that in to that one in particular. Like that one just comes top to mind. But now I'm curious to hear if you got like if you had to pull yourself back from getting too much into it almost when you were making it.
Yeah, the main thing I actually thought about for interaction was like how the spread was, but also like pool toys are filled with air. So I was actually thinking about like, well, if you're transforming the body into air, like how would that actually spread at that point? Because like, do you have like air pockets and stuff, or does it like spread around the body and then that turns into air? And then like I started thinking about like that sort of thing, because like that affects like how things can fold and stuff. Because if you have like a meaty tail boy inside of latex, it's not going to bend quite like a pool toy does if it's a bit deflated, and it's also not going to bend if it's like inflated. Like it just they have differences, and I wanted to do fold, so I was like, well, I kind of want it to be like air in there, because that also would be like that was the main focus that I kind of wanted to interact with, because I didn't do a lot of pool toys. So I did have to pull myself back in certain ways. Like I thought about like it's subconsciously kind of think about gravity at this point of like how do liquids kind of move down a thing. So I will think about it, but it's not like a hardcore thing anymore. Like when I was a younger artist, I was thinking about like how do liquid dynamics work, and like how do I actually want it to look, because like it can look real. Like you can think about like how fluid dynamics really actually work, but it doesn't always work in a drawing, or like it can look like it's doing the thing but not feel like it's doing the thing, and feeling like it's doing something is different from how it looks. And that's also becomes like a personal preference, because you'll get people who think that one way of liquid looks and feels a certain way, while like I will think like, well, the way that I draw it makes me feel like this is how liquid operates, even if it technically isn't like that. So it's just that balance of like, how do I actually want to approach that? And a lot of times it's both a combination of I've thought too hard, and also I'm not trying to think about it, because I just like cannot go into it that hard, because I know that I will just like cry at the end.
Well, let me just say, as an engineer who had to spend a decent amount of time in school learning about fluid mechanics and everything, I appreciate that you're even thinking about it, because I mean, I definitely think it comes across in your stuff, but also just generally, I appreciate that people are thinking about it because, TF, as much as it is a fantasy for everyone, sometimes I find that when you can ground it in a little bit of realism, it really makes it pop in like a more realistic way. And so any sort of like attention that gets put into that from that kind of real world perspective, I think really adds to a piece in terms of like enjoyment and hopefully in, being a nice product for the creator at the end of it. So I appreciate you going down the hole if it's any consolation.
Yeah, no, that's yeah. No, I was gonna go for software engineering, so my
Oh,
mind
okay.
kind of trends towards that like area too, of thinking about like, oh, there are things that like the world operates in a certain way, and like you kind of have to analyze that and work around it, and also kind of cobble things together in a way that like just kind of works at the end, even if like it's in the last 5 minutes. So yeah, that's where I kind of get my thought process too, is like from that side of like thinking about like, how to make array work with like a certain data set and turn in the project without failing. So like yeah, I like that a lot. Like if this is anecdotal, but I feel like a lot of TF people are also like into like engineering or like computer
Oh
science,
my
and
God, yes.
like I feel like a lot of people do think about that at that point, because like it gets really interesting when people are like thinking of like drawing out those things or like considering those things, and then they're just like, oh yeah, I got like a master's in biology, and it's just like, okay, well, that's why. And so it's always
Yeah,
interesting to
I
see.
will echo that. There are definitely a lot of STEM folks who are into TF, and it's always interesting because there's lots of people who are just in the art world. There's lots of people who are just in the STEM world, and then you have those folks who kind of like have a foot in each kind of like sphere. And I always think that it's a really interesting spot to kind of occupy because on the one hand, it's like you have that kind of analytical mindset. On the other hand, like you have the artistic inspiration, and I don't really think they clash. In fact, I think they almost always complement each other. But I do think it's funny you mentioned that because I definitely have noticed there's a lot of STEM folks in TF, and that definitely adds to, I think, the way in which a lot of then TF work gets created, because there is that kind of like thought for the analytical. And again, that's not to say that other folks don't think from an analytical perspective as well, because they absolutely do. But there's like this focus sometimes on like some of those like little minute details that I always appreciate that usually comes through.
Yeah, I think. Well, I always think like art is still a really technical skill, but that technical skill, I think, or I personally view art as like a communication skill that just has like extra steps to it. So like how people like information and how they think about it or know is important, because the art itself has to communicate a thing, which I think in art-ish spaces it's like your voice, and like that's the thing that's supposed to be speaking, but like, or like you're supposed to be responding to things, and like artsy people talk like that, where like I feel like if you find more analytical, not analytical and like oh they're more logical, but like there is a very technical, another very technical skill, and then there's art to communicate that technical skill, that you kind of find that difference of like more artsy people will think about like the broader concepts, and like how like will be usually a little bit better about communicating just an idea, while more technical people will like usually go like be more like methodical and go like I want to talk about like this little aspect that goes with this thing and this thing. And like it's very interesting to see like that approach to like how people express that artwork, and especially how they express then things like materials, because like how do you view seeing a material? Do you view it as something that like you feel inside your mind and like how you express that, or do you feel it in the way of like knowing the exact values of the gravity that's supposed to go down, and like how much it expands and its boiling point and its freezing point, and like all that stuff, where it's like it's very interesting to see like how people approach that in and of itself.
Yeah, and I always think that like those kind of differing perspectives, like you said, of like being more focused on communication versus being more focused on like the technical details, I think that both of those things always really come through in various like pieces of work in the TF community, and I just appreciate it. I want to like, just say that like thank you for having all these different perspectives, TF community, because I think we all benefit from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One day we will TF into a glob and gain all the
Yes.
knowledge and be able
Hive merge TF like oh. Cool. So we have some audience questions that I did pull out from one of our prior episodes, and I picked this one because I think it's funny that I actually have you on to answer your own question. So there's a question you asked last time about text and artwork, and the topic of text and artwork had been mentioned a few times. So what do you consider good writing or design for in-picture dialogue and text for TF artwork? And if applicable, which artists do you enjoy reading their in-picture dialogue?
So the type of design that I like for dialogue is usually just pictures that have dialogue in them. Not to like I know there's some that like people put to the side as kind of like a story, and then there's like the image, or you have the image and then the description. And like I always find that to be a weird disconnect for myself. 'Cause like it still works and it's still cool, but like having the dialogue in there means that when you have to reduce it and kind of like put like like usually you get more of a dialogue from people having to put that text in there and kind of like alluding to things, while also not doing like the whole idea of like, oh, you can't put words into a picture because the picture is supposed to speak for you. And like it's like language is a useful tool, so like why hamper yourself by reducing like the amount of communication you can have. So that's always my thought process behind it, is like you get extra information about the person's mind without having to like directly go like the person is thinking this, or be able to tell like oh, they're probably like from this country because like they're using these words, or they're from this region because they're using this dialect, or they're not from any of those places because like it's a mixture of things. And like I feel like that's like always a cool thing to see. For as for artists, I am bad with names. So like it is very hard for me to pick Braid, Burn Braid. has like does
Okay.
comic stuff, so like I like their dialogue a lot. Um,
Yeah.
there's I don't know, there's quite a few people that like I really like their dialogue because they like especially for TF stuff. There's like a few people who
Hmm.
like their dialogue is more like of I think kind of like what I do myself too, which is like they're kind of like talking to themselves as it's happening. So not directly describing like, oh no, this thing is happening, but like kind of like going through the motions of like, oh hey, like if you were in this situation, how would you react? And these are the things you would say. I'm just super bad with names.
No, that's totally chill. I think I think I want to push back on one thing. I always wonder, when text is kind of integrated into the actual picture itself, are you ever concerned about, distracting from the image itself? Because I personally enjoy when that text is overlaid over pictures and like you said, is doing like a stream of conscience with the person speaking, but some people I'm sure find it a bit off-putting, and I wonder if you, when you're like creating any pictures, do you ever think about that? Like, do you think about ways in which to make sure that it's fully integrated, or do you ever like consider like maybe I'm not going to put as much text, or does that ever enter your mind when you're doing that kind of a thing?
Um, to a certain extent, yeah. That like, because I know that people want to just have the image at points, but like
Hmm.
my whole interest in things is like more of the aspect of like the thought process and how things are going. So I don't I don't like I like pictures where you have to assume things, but like I'm much more happy when I can have like the input of what the person is thinking of. So that
Yeah,
distraction there is like not a distraction to me because it's like the main feature that I want. So
gotcha.
like that's supposed to be part of the poll in my mind. And
Hmm.
like with enough people who like just draw straight up like TF by itself, and that like when I was like one of the reasons I personally started writing dialogue in my stuff was that like I had somehow missed a bunch of people writing dialogue in their stuff. like um like later in life I found more people who were writing dialogue in their like works, but like
Hmm.
beforehand like I was just like TF is like the TF is cool, but you'd have like the separation of the description and stuff, and it's like it would be nice to like have those two things merged and mixed together, and like that was a main thing that like I really wanted to be there, and like it
Yeah.
being a like part of the picture wasn't a whole thing that I even really wanted to like consider as like I didn't want to like
Hmm.
have it like integrate to where like no one noticed it because it's like I want that to be noticed, which of course took time because like there was definitely some pictures where like there were better ways to integrate dialogue than others. I know there's like one drawing where like I wrote a shit ton of text, way too much text, and then I was just like, oh god, I can't fit it all. How do I separate this? And I had the bright idea of like writing the text like a regular paper with the character in the center. So then a lot of
Oh
people,
my God.
yeah, so a lot of people, what they did is they split it into two columns, which didn't work. So like people would like were joking for a while, like reading the thing as two columns, and like it didn't make any sense because like it wasn't
Oh yeah.
supposed to. But it also is kind of funny because you just get like really random statements, and it's just like okay, well,
Yeah.
that lesson learned, but also that's kind of funny.
That no, that is kind of funny. Yeah, I will say, on my end, I definitely really do appreciate the kind of comic style that a lot of folks do, and when they're kind of integrating dialogue and like text into TF artwork. So like people that come to mind, obviously, I think when I initially answered this, I mentioned you, but I know that like, other people who do like really great comic stuff include folks like Ember Bat or Silverclaw, I believe is their Twitter handle. And I know like Altered Zangi does great comics as well. And I think that like the way in which those folks will like kind of integrate text into their pictures in that kind of comic style can really be interesting because, like you said, it's like more reacting to what's happening rather than giving like a step-by-step description. And it's a nice kind of medium between like a written TF and an art TF. So yeah, I think of those people generally. But there's a lot, like you said, there's a lot of really good people who do it out there, and frankly, I'm also not the best with names, so um,
Yeah. Whoops.
that's just how it be.
Yeah. Whoopsie poops. Everyone
Yeah,
just needs to have like shorter names. Have it just be one
yeah,
letter, and then it'd be easier.
yeah. One letter.
I'll shorten my name to K, and then that'll be
Yeah,
easier for
I'll
everyone
be
else.
Z. Easy.
Okay.
Yeah, easy.
We solved
Um,
all the name problems.
we did. We solved all the problems. So the next question I have is from Fire. And so the question was, if you were to TF into an ideal form, how long do you think you'd last before wanting to change again? While we all have an ideal form, let's not kid ourselves in that we would be in that we'd be complacent in only one TF experience if we could have more. Um, I think when I initially, honestly, I don't remember what my initial answer to this, but I think I would probably want to TF again fairly soon, but I think also like if I have control over, what I can transform into, I'm gonna pick my Sona first and stay in that for a little while, and then I'll start experimenting with other things. But that would be kind of like my thoughts. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it depends on w- like how it worked because like if it was like one of those like you could only transform like once, then like of course it'd just be my Sona, and like that's the end of that. But if it was like you had the ability to change and like it wasn't any like oh you could never change back or like you, like if it was like once a month you could change, I'd be fine with that because then I would probably change like once a month. Um, and it would most likely just be like a variation of like my Sona plus another creature like I normally do. Like if it's like Mino March, I would just be like core, but also Mino. Um, and like I feel like that's what I would more likely do. But again, that depends on like what it is because like if you could change only like certain parts every so often, then like I I feel like I would probably like maybe change tails or something as like an aesthetic thing. It like it would really depend on how it would work because like if like I would be complacent with just transforming once into my Sona and then that's final. Um, but like also I'm not gonna say no if I can just keep transforming all the time.
Yeah, I feel like most people would just be like, yeah, I'll just keep TFing. Like, why the fuck not? You know?
Yeah, can't open up the pickle
I,
jar, just smash it with bare hands. There you go. That's
yeah,
life.
exactly.
Life is easier.
But okay, so here's an addendum that I'll ask because I think this is an interesting concept. So if you can just keep changing, would you just change directly from your new Sona, or would you go back to human first to experience the human to something else Sona
Uh,
change?
Probably just from Sona, because I'd make my Sona the default like form of myself, because like that's the form where like I feel like that's the idealized form that like I have. It would just be like my Sona plus my body type, currently, and then like just go from there. Because I've experienced human enough, and like what I was talking about previously of like the racism and stuff. It's like I've had a lot of shit times with it, so like I'm not that fond of it at points where it's just like I like if I'm gonna get like mean comments or something or like bad times with it, I'd rather be like fluffy with the tail, and then
Yeah,
also horns to
that's true.
poke people with if they are mean to me.
Yeah,
And like,
yeah. You mess with the core, you get the horns, you know? That's interesting. Yeah, no, I think I actually probably would go back through human, but not to like experience human that much, just to like get the process from human to something else. Not because I'm against like TFing from like my Lombax form or anything, because like I definitely would be down for that and have done that before. But I always find that like a common vector in my TF experience is going from human to something else. So I think I personally would probably still go back to human first, just to like as like almost like a transit stop point before going to the next thing. So yeah, it could be fun. Okay, and then the last question we have here is from Annoyed Dragon. I don't think we answered this one last time, so it's a new one. So Annoyed Dragon says a lot of transformation fantasy scenarios, such as the roaming werewolf one mentioned in a previous episode, involve non-consent. So the idea of some change being forced onto someone, or them forcing it onto themselves and becoming like a lust-driven creature. So how does the TF community come to terms with many common widespread transformation fantasies being non-consensual? I think that's an interesting question. Do you want to take it first, or do you want me to go first?
Um, I mean, my thoughts on it is very complicated because it's one of those again, like the whole point of TF is the process of change and all those things. So like the idea of like force is like just a thing that's going to happen. Like the idea of like, well, would you be forced? Would you not be forced? And especially where like werewolves are just like as a like general old rule was the idea of like losing your humanity, and like most people are not going to go like I consensually lose my humanity. So like that was always just immediately there. Like anyone at the start kind of creating those transformations were going to take the idea of like, well, you just lose it now. And like I don't at least like in the transformation community, it seems like people are still like, again, because that topic is brought up, people are hyper aware of that thing. So like it becomes that complicated situation where like a lot of people will actually change it to being something that's not bad, where it's like, oh well, like it's force, but it's for somebody who liked a thing, and like that was like it was like a nudge to get them to do the thing rather than being something that like was bad. But like you do have a range of that, and also like even like the nicer version of that is like, you know, the idea that like you're forced into a thing and you'll like it is also kind of bad, like worldwide or world like
Yeah, it can
IRL
be a little
wise.
toxic in real world
Yeah,
stuff.
because that like that's a thing that like bad people like will say is like, oh well, you'll like it, and like that's the explanation as to why it's fine that they like do horrible things. But so it becomes that like gray area of like it's not the best thing in the world, but also like in the community itself, I don't think it becomes that much of a problem. But because the community is within the range of the wider world, like it does need to be something that's considered at all points, and to make sure like that people who do those sorts of things are being very vocal of like, you know, consent is needed, and this is how consent works, and that this is fantasy. But even if this is fantasy, like why is this a thing that people are engaging with, in what way, and like have that discussion. Because I feel like if you have those more nuanced discussions just like in the wider world, like a lot of those issues from that involvement kind of melt away a little bit more, because then people are a lot more uh able to have the nuance of like why things are good or why things are bad. um because like like TF, like even like the non-consent thing isn't even like the worst one. I feel like the worst one would be like feral creatures in that sense, because like at that point you're not even talking about like you get people who like create mindsets that are like feral creatures, and like it, and today's society, like being feral means that you don't even have consent in the first place, because you need that cognizance to actually like deal with that.
Yes.
So like
Yeah, the loss of sentience.
yeah, so like that becomes a whole other thing of like you get like layers upon layers about like why it can be bad, but also when people engage with that and make their works, why like a lot of people actually turn it into like a discussion that's good, or at least is gray or neutral. And that's so like I feel like it's just like not the best thing in the world, but also not the worst thing in the world. And it's the worst part comes from the real world not being able to deal with that problem more so than the discussion itself, or like the topic itself happening in fantasy.
Yeah, I think I agree with some of what you've said. I think in particular with the TF community, I think there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes between what we're seeing as like non-consensual in a fantasy versus what's non-consensual in the real world. And there's definitely people who are like into that as a concept, but only specifically in the fantasy that they're engaging in. As soon as you kind of cross over into that being like a possibility in the real world, then there's kind of a shift of like, well, no, actually, I definitely want to make sure this is something that's consensual and such. And, I think it's a more nuanced topic than a lot of people give it credit for. And I think that, there is a tendency in plenty of discussions online to flatten stuff into like one or the other when really it's a lot of shades in between. Generally speaking, like if you're actually engaging in like, you know, some sort of like TF content IRL, like be it in like, in the bedroom or like in other sorts of like extended role playing or something, that is where I think it's really key to make sure things are actually consensual. When it crosses into more fiction stuff, like I just want people to be cognizant of it. If that is what you enjoy, then that is what you enjoy. I'm not gonna like yuck your yum all the time, but or in general, but like I think just so long as you're cognizant of like what the real world implications could be, so long as people are aware of that and you engage with the thing you're interested in a healthy manner, probably fine. I'm definitely not the moral authority on this, but I think that sometimes people flatten the discussion, and that's what I kind of resent because there's a lot more nuance to it that doesn't always get addressed, and I think people should just be, understanding that there are certain kinks that people enjoy from like a very psychological, like theoretical perspective, but would never want to actually do in real life. And I think there should be some space at least for that discussion.
Yeah, and then the more like I always feel like the more important thing for like if that discussion is happening is to have measures for like like making sure people aren't like or that you find the people who like are going to do the bad things with that or like are using the material in a bad way and having like ways of detecting that and going like hey this needs to be like fixed or like addressed so that like nothing bad happens because half of the reason why like it's bad to have those topics in those things or like in works and stuff is because people imitate that um because they're not really thinking about like the consequences or they like the consequences that are bad and it's just like that's like a thing
Yeah,
that
which
like
is even worse.
yeah which is like you're not like in no part of society can you stop that like every single part of society has those sorts of people and like that generally like ruins the fun for everyone when it's just like a like where one it's at some point it's like, or it's like movies where like you have violent movies no one's going out and doing violence because of those movies the majority of the time but you do have people who are like fixated on the violence really like the violence and then a percentage of those people who are like go like well I want to do that violence and that's the thing where like you need to detect that and go like you like no you can't do that because I also want like my Marvel movies where like they're beating a purple man and not feel like I'm watching a thing and then thinking that like people are gonna try to like finger snap everyone as a solution for world hunger. It's like I don't want like I want to make
Yeah,
sure
we
people
don't
don't
want
do
that.
that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, and this is a classic question of like, there's always the scares of like, oh, violence in video games, and it's like, no, like for the vast majority of these situations, it's because of much deeper societal problems. You can't just chalk it up to COD, but for the small percentage where maybe you can, there should obviously be a discussion around that. So
Yeah, and luckily humans trend more towards cooperation and helping each other and like being kind to each other. So like even in those situations where there's a bad thing, like luckily people do trend towards not doing the bad thing because they're cognizant of that. So like even with those like any of the like bad taboo topics, you do have like that weird gray area to where you can have that discussion like it still depends on like what the bad thing is because there are like less gray areas than others but like it's still just one of those things where like it is very hard to discuss because the implications are very bad but also the actual like happenings most of the time aren't and like you just want to reduce the most harm and or you want to reduce like all the harm but like you can't do that so you're going to try to reduce the most harm and like what does that actually mean to reduce harm and what does harm even mean in the first place.
yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, that's all the audience questions I had. Um, was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap things up here?
uh, uh my memory bad I feel like I did. um
It's chill if that's everything.
Uh, uh, Actually, kind of random topic,
Hmm.
but did you play or did you get a chance to play Jack and Daxter at all?
Oh yeah. Wow. Yes. I mean, as most people would probably assume, I am a massive Ratchet and Clank fan, but yes, I have in fact played Jack and Daxter too.
Hmm. So how do you feel about the transformation in that game and how Daxter rejects it?
It hurt me like inside because I'm like, man, you are so lucky. I would fucking love to be an Otzel, and he's just like, no, fuck this. I hate it. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, look, I get it, and honestly, it's a really interesting way to kind of handle the transformation in that video game series because like I mean obviously as TF fans we kind of want to like be like nah that's great and oftentimes there is especially with TF media I find that like when there's like the initial resistance usually later on down the story there might be like a moment where they're like oh I'm kind of okay with this and I don't really think that ever happens in Jack and Daxter, and I'm more than okay with that because again, I think it's like an interesting way to kind of handle the concept. Do I wish it was a much more drawn out and better depicted TF? Yes, but I mean, it was when I forget when the first game came out, but this was like PS2 era, so like with what they did what they could with what they had, and I just appreciate that there was even like TF embedded into the story in any way, because definitely back in those days, I was looking for that kind of content, and if it was there in some fashion, I was like, sold, I'm happy.
Yeah, same. Also, you just may realize that he did kind of just poof TF, didn't he?
He
He
did
just
absolutely
poofed
just
TF.
poof TF.
Oh
Yeah.
no.
Which, like, again, I'm like, you know what? That was what they could do with the graphics at the time. I'm not going to complain. Also, I will pick TF in the media over no TF in the media any day. I don't actually have that much of a problem with poof TF, although obviously I would like to not, if I was going through TF, I would want to not pick that. But again, like, any TF is better than no TF, and I think poof TF has more of a value than sometimes it's given. So.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm very much of the process sort of person. Although Turning
Yeah.
Red has made me think about Poof TF in a weird way because of a thing that they did, which was like, okay, well,
Yeah, they did it in an interesting way at least, because like you can have parts of it poof TF, not the whole thing, and that I feel like is like almost a process of TF. So like I can definitely deal with that, you know.
yeah. Also, the infinite jump. Fucking, I can't believe they gave her an infinite jump. Like, what
Yeah,
the
that
fuck?
was amazing. Oh, amazing. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. If folks are looking for you, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It was very fun and cool. And
Yeah.
they can find me on Koorivlf.com because I made it to where I link everywhere that I exist.
Yes.
Which is like Koorivlf, which
It's
is
very handy.
the very fun website and also has very cool redirects as well. That makes it easier. Like, I also have a safe work. So like, if you do safe or sfw.corvolf.com, you can like go to my safe work, or if you
Ah.
want to go to like my Twitter, it can either be like twitter.corvolf.com or just tw.corvolf.com because I'm lazy, so I made things short.
I love it. I didn't even know there was like a safer work version of that website. I've clicked through them before many a time, so that is good to know. Awesome. Well, thank you again, and I hope everyone enjoyed listening to this episode of the TF Tuesday podcast. We'll be, coming back to you with more episodes again in kind of a slightly different format. So I hope y'all continue to stick around and stay TFy.